I only hope my brother knows how expensive my babysitting charges are.
Giving us our first glimpse of the new parents at home.
When the second in line to the British throne accidentally stumbles upon a heated discussion between his parents in the private corridors of Windsor Castle, the words he hears will fundamentally alter the trajectory of his young life. What began as an ordinary November evening becomes the moment everything changes for 10-year-old Prince George Alexander Louis of Wales. The overhead conversation. The autumn rain pelted against the ancient windows of Windsor Castle as Prince George made his way down the dimly lit corridor toward his parents' private study. He had left his mathematics textbook in the room earlier that afternoon, and with homework due the following morning, he needed to retrieve it before bedtime. The young prince walked quietly in his slippers, the thick carpets muffling his footsteps as he approached the heavy oak door. But as he reached for the brass handle, voices from within stopped him cold. They were raised voices, tense and strained in a way he had rarely heard from his parents. Prince William's tone carried frustration and concern, while Princess Catherine's voice trembled with emotion. George froze, his hand hovering inches from the door. "We cannot keep pretending this is sustainable," William's voice cut through the silence. "He's 10 years old, Catherine. 10. And already the pressure is crushing him. Did you see his face during the last official engagement? He looked terrified." "I know," Catherine replied, her voice thick with suppressed tears. "But what choice do we have? This is his destiny. This is what he was born into." "Destiny?" William's voice rose sharply. "Is it his destiny to have anxiety attacks before state dinners? To lose sleep worrying about making mistakes in public? He's a child, for God's sake. Our child." George's heart pounded in his chest. They were talking about him. Every word struck like a physical blow, revealing truths he had sensed but never fully understood. His parents thought he was struggling. They thought he was suffering under the weight of his future role. "The institution will never change," Catherine said quietly. "Your father tried. Your grandmother before him tried. But the monarchy has its own momentum, its own demands. George will be king one day, and nothing we do can alter that fundamental reality." "Then perhaps it's time we changed what that reality looks like," William countered firmly. "I will not sacrifice my son's childhood, his mental health, his happiness, for tradition. Not anymore. Things have to change, Catherine. They have to." The silence that followed stretched long and heavy. George stood paralyzed in the hallway, his mind racing through every official event, every photograph, every moment when he had felt the eyes of millions upon him. He thought about the times he had wanted to play football with his friends but had protocol training instead. The birthday parties he had missed because of royal obligations. The constant reminders that he must behave perfectly because the whole world was watching. "What are you proposing?" Catherine finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "A complete restructuring of how we prepare him," William said with determination. "New protocols, different expectations. I want him to have what I never had, what you never had. I want him to have a real childhood while we still have time to give him one." George's hand slowly dropped from the door handle. The textbook was forgotten. And in that moment, standing alone in the corridor while rain lashed the windows and his parents debated his fate, Prince George understood that his life would never be the same. The weight of succession. The conversation Prince George overheard that November evening was not born from a single incident, but from years of accumulating concerns that had reached a breaking point. Prince William and Princess Catherine had watched their eldest son grow from a carefree toddler into an increasingly anxious young boy, bearing the psychological weight of his future crown. The transformation had been gradual but undeniable, and it terrified them. From the moment George was born on July 22, 2013, his life trajectory was set. He would one day become King George VII, following his grandfather King Charles and his father Prince William. But what seemed like a distant, almost fairy tale future when he was a baby had become an increasingly present reality as he grew older. With each passing year, the demands increased, the scrutiny intensified, and the freedom diminished. The Wales family had tried desperately to maintain normalcy for their children. George attended Thomas's Battersea Preparatory School alongside children from non-royal families. He played football, took swimming lessons, and participated in school plays. But normalcy was always an illusion, always temporary. Security officers shadowed his every move. Photographers camped outside school events. His classmates' parents signed non-disclosure agreements. Even his most private moments of childhood were conducted under the ever-present awareness that he was different, special, and burdened with a responsibility he had never chosen. William had experienced his own traumatic childhood in the public eye, losing his mother, Princess Diana, when he was just 15 years old. The memory of those cameras, that relentless media attention during the most painful period of his life, haunted him still. He had vowed that his own children would be protected, shielded from the worst excesses of public fascination with the royal family. But he was discovering that protection had its limits when your child is second in line to the throne. Catherine, despite her middle-class upbringing, had adapted remarkably to royal life. But she had the advantage of choosing this path as an adult, of falling in love with William and consciously accepting what that love would require. George had no such choice. He had been born into a gilded cage, and watching him slowly realize the bars existed was breaking her heart. The specific incident that triggered the argument George overheard had occurred 3 weeks earlier during a state banquet at Buckingham Palace. George, dressed in formal attire, had been required to attend a portion of the event alongside his parents. It was meant to be a brief appearance, a gentle introduction to the ceremonial aspects of royal duty. But as they entered the grand ballroom with hundreds of dignitaries watching, George had frozen. His face had gone pale, his hands had trembled, and for a terrifying moment, William thought his son might actually collapse. Catherine had smoothly intervened, leaning down to whisper something in George's ear while maintaining her composed public smile. George had managed to move forward, to complete the required greetings and photographs. To the outside world, it had been a successful introduction of the young prince to state occasions. But his parents had seen the truth. They had seen the panic in his eyes, the way his breathing had become shallow and rapid, the tremor in his hand when he shook hands with the visiting dignitaries. That night, after George was safely in bed, William and Catherine had their first serious conversation about the trajectory they were on. It was not sustainable. Their son was developing genuine anxiety about his public role, and he was only 10 years old. What would happen at 15, at 20? William had spent sleepless nights researching childhood development, consulting privately with child psychologists, and reaching out discreetly to other royal families who had navigated similar challenges. He thought about his own struggles, the years of therapy he had needed as an adult to process his childhood trauma. He thought about Prince Harry, his brother, whose rebellion against royal constraints had ultimately led him to step back from official duties entirely. The institution had a way of breaking people, even those born to it. Especially those born to it. The tension between these competing imperatives had been building for months. Small disagreements about George's schedule, about which events he should attend, about how much privacy he deserved, had escalated into fundamental questions about their parenting priorities. Were they raising a future king or raising a healthy, happy child? Could they do both? And if forced to choose, which took precedence? For the first time in their marriage, William and Catherine found themselves on opposite sides of a fundamental question about their son's future, and the stakes could not have been higher. Behind closed doors at Windsor. In the days following the overheard conversation, Prince George moved through his routine with a new awareness that colored everything. Morning lessons with his tutors, afternoon sports activities, evening family dinners, all continued as normal on the surface. But internally, George was processing a revelation that had fundamentally altered his understanding of his own life. His parents were worried about him. More than worried, they were fighting about how to protect him from something he had always assumed was simply inevitable. He said nothing to anyone about what he had heard, not to his younger siblings, Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis, who remained blissfully unaware of the weight that rested specifically on George's shoulders as the eldest, not to his friends at school, most of whom treated him normally despite his royal status but could never fully understand his unique burden, and certainly not to his parents, who he instinctively knew would be horrified that he had overheard their private argument. Instead, George watched and listened with heightened attention. He noticed things he had previously accepted without question. The way his father's jaw tightened during discussions about upcoming public engagements, the sadness in his mother's eyes when photographers appeared during what was supposed to be a private family outing, the careful way both parents asked about his feelings, probing gently to understand his emotional state without making him feel interrogated. Meanwhile, Prince William was taking action. He requested a private audience with King Charles at Clarence House, arriving alone and requesting that no private secretaries or aides be present. The meeting was tense from the outset. Charles, now settled into his reign after decades as heir apparent, had his own strong views on royal duty and the preparation of future monarchs. "You coddle the boy," Charles said bluntly when William explained his concerns. "I understand your protective instincts, believe me. But George has responsibilities, William. He is not just your son. He belongs to the nation, to the Commonwealth. The sooner he accepts that reality, the better prepared he will be." "He is 10 years old," William replied, struggling to keep his voice level. "He has nightmares about making mistakes in public. He asks me whether people will still love him if he says the wrong thing during an engagement. This is not healthy preparation, father. This is psychological damage." Charles was quiet for a long moment, and William glimpsed something unexpected in his father's expression. Pain, perhaps. Recognition. "I had nightmares too," the king finally admitted. "My mother, your grandmother. She believed in duty above all else. I was prepared for my role with military precision and emotional distance. And yes, it was difficult, but I endured, and it made me who I am. And is that what we want for George?" William pressed. "To endure? To survive his childhood rather than enjoy it? I want better for my son than mere endurance." The conversation continued for over 2 hours, ranging from specific concerns about George's schedule to broader philosophical questions about the monarchy's role in modern Britain. Catherine, meanwhile, was conducting her own quiet campaign. She reached out to child development experts, meeting with them privately and off the record. She researched educational approaches used by other European royal families, some of whom had successfully modernized while maintaining their institutional roles. She even, in a move that would have shocked the royal household had they known, consulted with Prince Harry about his own childhood experiences and what he wished had been different. Harry's response was immediate and emphatic. "Protect him," he told Catherine via video call from California. "I know you think you are, but you need to do more. The institution will consume him if you let it. It will take everything that makes George himself and reshape it into what it thinks a future king should be. Don't let that happen. Fight for him while there's still time." The words haunted Catherine. As November progressed toward December, plans began to take shape. William and Catherine developed a detailed proposal for restructuring George's schedule and preparation. Fewer public appearances, more time for normal childhood activities. Therapy sessions with a child psychologist who specialized in children growing up under extreme pressure. A dramatic reduction in formal protocol training in favor of general education and personal development. What they did not know was that George himself was developing his own perspective on his future, shaped by what he had overheard and by his own emerging understanding of who he wanted to be. The young prince was no longer a passive recipient of others' decisions about his life. He was beginning to form his own vision of what his future might look like, and that vision would surprise everyone. A future rewritten. The turning point came during the first week of December, when Prince George did something unprecedented for a child in his position. He asked to speak with his parents formally. Not at dinner, not during their usual family time, but in his father's study with the door closed. He wanted, he told them seriously, to discuss his future. William and Catherine exchanged concerned glances as they settled into the study's comfortable chairs, their 10-year-old son sitting across from them with an expression of determination that seemed far too mature for his age. George had clearly been planning this conversation, perhaps rehearsing it, and that alone was enough to make Catherine's heart ache with protective love. "I heard you arguing," George began without preamble. "About 3 weeks ago, I came to get my textbook and you were talking about me, about whether I could handle being king someday." The color drained from William's face. This was precisely what he had feared, what they had tried so hard to prevent. "George, we never wanted you to hear that. We were just talking through some concerns, trying to figure out the best way to support you." "I know," George said calmly, "and I've been thinking about it ever since. About everything you said, about what it means that I'm going to be king." Catherine leaned forward, reaching for her son's hand. "Darling, you don't need to worry about this now. You're 10 years old. You have your whole childhood ahead of you before any of these responsibilities become real." "But that's not true though, is it?" George's voice was quiet but firm. "I'm already doing royal things. I'm already second in line to the throne. People already expect things from me that they don't expect from Charlotte or Louis. Pretending that's not happening doesn't make it go away." The maturity in his voice stunned them both into silence. William felt a complex mixture of pride and sorrow. His son was growing up, developing his own understanding of his unique position, but he was growing up too fast, forced into awareness of burdens that should wait for adulthood. George continued, his words coming more quickly now, as if he had been holding them back for weeks. "I get scared sometimes during public things. The state banquet was really hard. There were so many people watching, and I kept thinking about all the things I might do wrong. But Papa, I was scared because I didn't understand what I was supposed to be doing or why it mattered. Nobody explained it to me. I was just told to smile and shake hands and be polite." "That's our fault," William said, his voice rough with emotion. "We've been trying to protect you from the pressure, but we ended up leaving you confused and anxious instead. That was wrong of us." "I don't want to stop doing royal things," George said, and this surprised both parents. "I know that sounds weird after what I just said, but it's true. I like meeting people from different countries. I think it's interesting learning about how the government works. I want to help people, like you and Mum do with your charities. I just want to understand it better. I want to know why we do these things, not just be told to do them." Catherine felt tears threatening and blinked them back. Her son was asking for precisely what they had been fighting to give him, the chance to engage with his future role on his own terms, with understanding and agency rather than blind obedience to protocol. "What if we could change how you learn about being royal?" William asked slowly, an idea forming. "What if instead of just training you in protocols and ceremonies, we focused on teaching you the history and purpose behind it all? You could learn about the Commonwealth, about constitutional monarchy, about why Britain still has a royal family, and what role we play in modern society. Would that feel different?" George nodded eagerly. "Yes, exactly. I want to know the why, not just the what. And I want more time to just be normal too. Can I have both?" "You can have both," Catherine promised fiercely. "We're going to make sure of it. Your father and I have been working on new plans for your schedule, for how we prepare you for your future. It's going to mean some big changes, but the goal is exactly what you're asking for. Time to be a child and time to learn about your responsibilities in ways that make sense and don't overwhelm you." Over the next hour, the three of them talked with remarkable honesty about George's feelings, his fears, and his hopes. He admitted that he sometimes resented Charlotte and Louis for having more freedom. He confessed that he worried constantly about disappointing people. But he also revealed that he had been reading about previous kings and queens on his own, trying to understand what made some of them successful and beloved, while others struggled. "I read about Queen Elizabeth I," George said. "She became queen when everything was really complicated and difficult, but she figured it out. She was smart and strong and people loved her. I want to be like that. But I don't want to have to give up being happy to do it." William's throat tightened with emotion. His son was grappling with questions that had haunted every heir to the throne throughout history, the balance between personal fulfillment and public duty. But George was approaching these questions with impressive wisdom, seeking integration rather than sacrifice. "The fact that you're thinking about this so thoughtfully tells me you're going to be an extraordinary king someday," William said. "But George, being a good king doesn't mean being unhappy. It doesn't mean sacrificing your childhood or your mental health. We're going to find a better way forward, all of us together." When they finally emerged from the study, Charlotte was waiting in the hallway with characteristic directness. "Was that about George being king?" she asked. "Because he's been really weird lately." William couldn't help but smile. "Yes, it was about that. But everything's going to be fine." "Good," Charlotte said matter-of-factly. "I told Louis that George just needed to talk to you about king stuff. I'm glad he finally did it." The casual acceptance from his younger sister seemed to lighten something in George's expression. His family understood, they supported him, and together they would navigate the extraordinary path ahead. The royal education debate. The proposal William and Catherine presented to the palace household in mid-December was nothing short of revolutionary by royal standards. They called it the Windsor Initiative, named for the castle where George's overheard conversation had catalyzed this entire rethinking of royal preparation. The document outlined a comprehensive restructuring of how the young prince would be educated and prepared for his eventual role as king. The core principles were radical in their simplicity. First, George's mental health and emotional well-being would be the primary consideration in all decisions about his schedule and activities. Second, his education about royal duties would emphasize understanding and critical thinking, rather than rote protocol memorization. Third, his public appearances would be dramatically reduced and carefully calibrated to his developmental readiness. Fourth, he would have regular access to professional mental health support as a normal part of his upbringing, not a crisis intervention. The reaction from the royal household was mixed, and in some quarters openly hostile. Sir Malcolm Hutchinson, the deputy private secretary who had served 3 generations of royals, was particularly vehement in his opposition during the initial review meeting. "Your Royal Highnesses," he said with barely concealed frustration, "these proposals fundamentally undermine centuries of established practice." "And there are also reasons," William countered firmly, "that multiple members of this family have required extensive therapy, struggled with substance abuse, or fled royal life entirely. Perhaps it's time we acknowledge that those traditional methods have significant flaws." The tension in the room was palpable. Catherine watched several members of the household staff shift uncomfortably, caught between their loyalty to tradition and their genuine affection for the young prince. She knew that winning this battle would require more than emotional appeals. They needed to demonstrate that modernizing George's preparation would benefit the monarchy itself, not just their son. "The world has changed dramatically since King Charles was prepared for his role," Catherine said, choosing her words carefully. "The media landscape is completely different. Public expectations of mental health awareness have evolved. If we want the monarchy to remain relevant and respected, we need to show that we understand contemporary values while maintaining our essential purpose." Lady Sarah Pemberton, the Queen's former private secretary who now advised the King, spoke up thoughtfully. "I don't think anyone here disputes that some adaptation is necessary. The question is how much change is prudent and how to implement it without undermining the institution's credibility." This opened the door for productive discussion. Over the following weeks, William and Catherine negotiated with palace officials, historical advisors, and constitutional experts. They consulted with representatives from other European monarchies who had successfully modernized their approaches to preparing young royals. They even, discreetly, gathered data on public opinion about royal children and found overwhelming support for protecting their privacy and normalcy. "Then perhaps," William suggested carefully, "we should change the rule itself. Make mental health support and age-appropriate preparation the standard for all royal children going forward. This doesn't have to be just about George. It could be about reforming how the institution treats all young members of the family." By early January, a compromise proposal emerged. George's public appearances would be reduced by approximately 60% compared to the original schedule. He would receive regular sessions with a child psychologist specializing in children in unique circumstances with strict confidentiality protections. His education would include new curricula on constitutional history, Commonwealth relations, and modern monarchy studies, designed to build understanding rather than just protocol knowledge. Critically, the compromise also included a provision that George himself had requested during a follow-up conversation with his parents. He wanted to spend time with young people his age from across the Commonwealth, learning about their lives and perspectives. This would become an annual program, carefully structured to be educational rather than ceremonial, giving George genuine connections beyond the palace walls. When the final proposal was presented to King Charles for approval, he read it slowly and carefully, his expression unreadable. William and Catherine waited anxiously, knowing that without the king's support, their reforms would be dead in the water, regardless of household agreement. "This is not how I was raised," Charles finally said. "Not how my mother was raised, nor her father before her. You're asking me to approve a fundamental departure from tradition." "Yes, Your Majesty," William replied formally, then more softly. "But I'm also asking you, as a father and grandfather, to help us protect George in ways that perhaps we weren't protected, to give him tools and support that might prevent the struggles we faced." Charles looked at his son for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. Perhaps he was thinking of his own difficult childhood, his complicated relationship with both parents, the years of feeling misunderstood and constrained by royal duty. Perhaps he was thinking of Harry, now living in self-imposed exile, driven away by those same institutional pressures. Perhaps he was simply thinking of George, his eldest grandchild, still so young and already bearing such weight. "Very well," the king said quietly. "Implement your reforms. We'll call it a pilot program, subject to review. But understand, William, you're changing something fundamental here. There will be resistance and criticism. Are you prepared for that? For George?" William said without hesitation. "Yes, absolutely," moving forward under new understanding. Spring arrived at Windsor Castle with an explosion of color in the gardens, and with it came the first tangible changes in Prince George's life under the new protocols. The transformation was subtle to outside observers but profound for the family experiencing it. George's schedule lightened noticeably, with entire weekends now designated as private family time with no official obligations whatsoever. The sessions with Dr. Emily Richardson, the child psychologist brought in to work with George, began in February. Initially apprehensive about talking to a stranger about his feelings, George gradually discovered that having someone outside the family to discuss his unique pressures was genuinely helpful. Dr. Richardson specialized in helping children navigate high-pressure situations, though she admitted privately to Catherine that she had never worked with anyone quite like a future king before. "What's remarkable, Doctor?" Richardson told William and Catherine during one of their regular update meetings, "is how well George understands his own emotional landscape when given the space to explore it. He's developing excellent self-awareness and coping strategies. The anxiety he was experiencing wasn't about lacking resilience. It was about lacking context and control. Did you know," George told Charlotte excitedly one evening, "that when Parliament was first established, the king had way more power than the monarch does now? But over centuries, the system changed so that elected officials made most decisions. We're sort of like a symbol of national unity and continuity now, but we don't actually run the country. That's Parliament's job." Charlotte rolled her eyes good-naturedly. "You're such a nerd about king stuff now." But George didn't mind the teasing. He began asking thoughtful questions during family dinners about his father's work, about the charities his mother supported, about the Commonwealth and Britain's place in the world. The reduction in public appearances was perhaps the most visible change. When George did appear at official events, he was noticeably more relaxed and confident. The terrified boy who had frozen at the state banquet was replaced by a young man who understood why he was there and what his presence represented. He still got nervous, he admitted to his parents, but it was manageable nervousness rather than overwhelming panic. The Commonwealth Youth Connection program launched in April with George's first virtual meeting with young people from across the Commonwealth nations. Sitting in a specially prepared room at Windsor Castle, he spoke via video conference with teenagers from Australia, Canada, Jamaica, New Zealand, and Kenya. They discussed climate change, education, and what they hoped for the future. For George, It was revelatory to hear from his contemporaries who lived such different lives, but shared many of the same concerns and dreams. They were actually really cool, he told his parents afterward with genuine enthusiasm. This girl from Jamaica, she's starting a recycling program in her community. And there's a guy in Kenya who built a website to connect students with scholarship opportunities. They're doing such amazing things. William and Catherine exchanged satisfied glances. This was exactly what they had hoped for. George developing a genuine connection to the diverse peoples of the Commonwealth rather than viewing them as abstract subjects to be ceremonially acknowledged. More privately, there were tensions within the extended royal family. Some members felt that William and Catherine were receiving special accommodations not available to others. There were whispered complaints that the Wales children were being raised differently than previous generations, with implications that this somehow reflected poorly on how others had been parented. But William and Catherine remained firm in their convictions. They had seen the alternative, the psychological cost of traditional preparation, in their own lives and in the lives of other family members. If protecting George meant weathering criticism, they would do it gladly. King Charles, for his part, observed the changes with complex emotions. There was some defensiveness, an inevitable feeling that the reforms implicitly criticized how he had been raised and how he had raised William. But there was also growing recognition that his grandson was thriving under this new approach in ways that validated William and Catherine's instincts. During a private moment at a family gathering in May, Charles pulled George aside for a brief conversation. "Your father tells me you've been enjoying your new history lessons," the king said. "Yes, Grandpapa," George replied respectfully. "Professor Chen makes it really interesting. We're learning about the Glorious Revolution and how constitutional monarchy developed." "When I was your age," Charles said quietly, "nobody explained to me why things were done the way they were. I was simply told what was expected and required to comply. I think your father's approach is wiser. Understanding is more valuable than unquestioning obedience." George looked up at his grandfather with surprise and something like gratitude. The king's approval, offered so rarely and carefully, meant more than he had expected. "Thank you, Grandpapa. I'm trying to learn as much as I can. You're going to be a fine king someday, George," Charles said, placing a hand on his grandson's shoulder. "But take your time getting there. Enjoy being young while you can." As summer approached, the Wales family took their first truly private vacation in years, a week in Scotland with strict instructions to the security detail to maintain maximum distance. They hiked, fished, played board games in the evening, and existed simply as a family rather than as royal figures. For George especially, the freedom was transformative. On the last evening of the vacation, as they sat around a fireplace in the cottage they had rented, George spoke up quietly. "Thank you for fighting for me. I know you changed a lot of things so I could have more time to just be a kid. I really appreciate it." William felt his eyes sting with unexpected tears. "You never have to thank us for that, George. Protecting you, making sure you're happy and healthy, that's just being your parents." "I know," George said, "but I also know it wasn't easy. People were probably upset about the changes. I just wanted you to know that I noticed, and I'm grateful." Catherine pulled her eldest son into a tight embrace, overwhelmed by love and pride for this thoughtful, aware young man who somehow remained a child despite everything asked of him. "We'd do it again in a heartbeat," she whispered, 1,000 times over. The overhead conversation that had seemed like a crisis back in November had ultimately catalyzed the most important changes the family had ever made. Prince George's future had been rewritten, not in terms of his ultimate destiny as king, but in terms of the path he would take to get there. And that path, now, would allow him to arrive with his mental health intact, his childhood preserved, and his humanity fully developed. He would still be king someday. That fundamental reality remained unchanged. But he would be a king who had been allowed to be a child first, who understood his role rather than merely performed it, and who had parents willing to challenge an entire institutional system to protect his well-being. The transformation in Prince George's preparation for his future role demonstrates how even the most traditional institutions can evolve when family comes first. If this story of royal evolution and parental determination resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth explorations of the modern monarchy. Share your thoughts in the comments about balancing tradition with well-being. Thank you for reading.